Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of Employsure Essentials. Today we're going to be having a chat with Tariq Nasri, one of our senior advisors here at Employsure, and we're going to cover off some of the complexities of unfair dismissals. Now we're seeing more and more claims in the Fair Work Commission from employees, and unfortunately it seems to be the process employers are using in terminating an employee that's bringing them unstuck. Today, Tariq's going to give you some tips on how you can manage this process regardless of the type of business or the industry you're in. So let's get into it. Hi Tariq, thanks for coming today.
No, thank you for having me.
So today we're going to have a bit of a chat about unfair dismissals and some of the things that can lead to that. And I think the big piece is employers getting termination wrong. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah. So there's probably a couple of termination processes that really come to mind. And when you and I were discussing this, capability termination was one that jumped off the page at me. What exactly does that mean?
Yeah, so look, capability termination refers to an employee's ability or lack of ability to perform the inherent requirements of their role. So that could be on as a result of their physical capacity or their mental capacity. And I guess in terms of the takeaway for capability termination, it always comes down to, is the employee in a situation where they can no longer medically perform the inherent requirements of their role? So that requires going through a process, understanding their current capacity, seeking medical information as to whether they can return to their role, what reasonable accommodations can be made to that role, and if in view of all those types of things and among any other areas they can't do their role, then you're potentially looking at a position where they can no longer actually perform the inherent requirements of their role. So not to do with performance conduct, it's purely to do with capacity. Yeah,
so the physical ability to do it, I suppose.
Yeah, or mental.
Yeah. Okay, good point. Point. I suppose that's across every industry too. So, I mean, is there a process on that one for employers, or does it vary depending on the industry, depending on the job?
Yeah, look, there is a process, and it does depending on a job. Obviously, if you're in a more blue-collar industry or labour industry, capability process or terminations will be more common there. In terms of the process, and to give a brief overview of that, you're looking for, periods of absence, not necessarily short-term, but long-term absences as a trigger. The employee providing medical information that they'll be away for a certain period of time. Now, these can be work-related and also unwork-related injuries. Now, when they're work-related injuries, you also have to factor in potential workers' compensation into that, so it can get very complex. And at the end of the day, ultimately decisions should be made on whether the employee can return to work or not, and that's based on length of absence, reasonable accommodations to the role, or medical evidence indicating that.
Yeah, so it's quite a lot to consider there just for that one piece, isn't it? You can see why a lot of people get unfair dismissal claims on that one.
Yes, definitely.
Shifting gears slightly, performance management termination is a term that we flagged earlier. Now, I suppose to put it ineloquently, it would be something like managing someone out, I'm sure. Is that common? Do you see people trying to do that, or...?
Yeah, most definitely. And it's one used, very commonly where an employer is in a situation with an employee where there's no real issues such as misconduct or anything where they can really look at, and this employee is just genuinely performing poorly, not meeting the requirements of their role. So yeah, and that's, where that term managing the employee comes from.
It tends to be, obviously it's quite risky because it's coming to a lot of unfair dismissal claims. Is it a long process?
Yes, it can be. As far as from an unfair dismissal perspective, and in terms of looking at previous matters the Commission's made a determination on, what they look at is, has the employer gone through procedural fairness? And as part of procedural fairness, have they had a discussion with the employee and communicated what those expectations are? Are those expectations specific, measurable, achievable, reliable, and timely? So in other words, is it fair? Can the employee actually do it? Have they given reasonable training and support to meet those requirements? And have they been given enough time to meet those requirements? In other words, so in terms of what we advise, we generally look to it's case by case basis, but you're potentially looking for about 3 months. But yeah, it definitely there is a specific requirement there. Yeah,
so it's quite lengthy, and I suppose it's definitely one to tread carefully on. Now, terminating an employee often goes awry and these things happen, which is why you guys are so busy. Sometimes employees, what's called abandonment of employment, I understand. Sometimes employees just don't make it clear whether they're coming back, or talk us a bit about that one. What does that mean? What does abandonment of employment mean?
So abandonment of employment is basically when the employee quite literally disappears. So, if they're required to come to work on Monday and they haven't come to work, you've tried contacting them, send them emails, contact the emergency contacts you may have on file, file, you've heard nothing, come Tuesday, comes Wednesday, you still haven't heard anything, then you're in a potential situation where the employee has abandoned their role. So what it essentially means is that the employee hasn't come to work, they're not returning to work, you've tried contacting them, they haven't contacted you back, and you're in a situation where, where is this individual? So at that point, what we advise is that, if you've made it numerous attempts to contact this person, you go through that abandonment of employment process in writing to let the employee know that they've got a specific time within which to either return to work or to contact them. And if they fail to do so, that will result in termination of their employment by way of abandonment.
So it's about making it clear that something needs to be either said or confirmed here. With unfair dismissals, it comes down to a lot of the evidence you've got. So even in abandonment of employment, employers should be documenting whether they make contact and who they contacted. Is that fair, or is it more about just trying to get this employee to let you know?
No, it's 100% correct. A lot of the, defenses for unfair dismissal are very process-driven, and it all comes down to what you can and can't prove. So if you've made numerous contacts, document that on file. When we always advise to send out notification of abandonment of employment prior to termination, so you have written notice to the employee to provide them as much, opportunity as possible to return to work prior to making a final decision. So, documentation is key in terms of setting yourself up for success when it comes to an unfair dismissal claim.
So I suppose that flows quite nicely onto to the next question I was going to put to you. We always like to finish with a bit of a top tip for employers. I think you've just nailed it. Documentation is key. Surely that's got to be up there, but what else should employers be doing? Is there something that every time they terminate an employee they should be being careful about?
Yeah, I think it's about documentation, but also ensuring that the documentation you have from a process and policy perspective is correct and provided to employees so that they are aware. Because at the end of the day, to rely on these policies and procedures, firstly, they need to be correct and fair, but also employees need to be aware of the standards and expectations in the workplace. And if all that, if you've dotted your I's, crossed your T's, when you do come to rely on them, you're in the best position possible to apply it. And when you do apply it consistently across the board to all employees. And that essentially, going back to what I said earlier, sets them up for success when it comes to a claim.
So Tariq, make sure the policies and procedures are in place, you're across it, and employees know how to do it as well.
Exactly right.
Spot on. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure.
Well, there's the essentials. As Tariq said, every termination is different, but ultimately it comes down to the process and policies your business is using and how you manage employees on the way out the door. As always, Employsure is here to assist, so give us a call on 1300 651 415 for any advice in terminating employees or responding to an unfair dismissal claim. With this being the last episode of our Employsure Essentials podcast series, I hope you've enjoyed it and certainly learned some things along the way. Stay tuned as we'll have a new podcast series coming in 2018.